Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Malthrop, Chief Executive here and proud member. Today's August 7th, and you're with a virtual City Club forum live from the studios of 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream. They're our public media partner. Big thanks to them. As we enter the 8th month of the coronavirus pandemic, it has become increasingly clear that a vaccine is likely the only way the world returns to anything close to what we might think of as normal. What's happening right now, though, is unprecedented. There are currently more than 165 vaccines under development around the world. Many have moved beyond animal trials to human trials, and a few are in phase 3 trials involving tens of thousands of participants. Several of the companies involved have expressed optimism that their vaccines could be ready for widespread distribution in late 2020 or early 21. But is this actually realistic? Today, we'll learn more about the path and process to a potential COVID-19 vaccine. Our City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum speaker is Dr. Susan Bailey, a distinguished allergist and immunologist from Fort Worth, Texas. Dr. Bailey is the 175th president of the American Medical Association. She's the third consecutive woman to hold the position. Dr. Bailey has been in private practice for more than 30 years. She completed her residency in general pediatrics and a fellowship in allergy and immunology at the Mayo Graduate School of Medicine in Rochester, Minnesota. She has been awarded the title of Distinguished Fellow of the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. Dr. Bailey has held numerous leadership positions within the AMA before being sworn in as president in June. And as in every City Club forum, you can participate with your questions. You can text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. Or if you're on Twitter, tweet your question at the City Club and we will work them into the program. Dr. Bailey, welcome to the City Club of Cleveland.
Thank you, Dan. I am so glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. I sure wish we could all be together in person, but events like this help us keep in touch. So I'm grateful that at least we have this opportunity to get together.
Indeed, we do. And let me just say that in past forums, since we began COVID, we've been doing an interview, but today you're going to deliver a speech, and we're delighted about that. Go ahead.
Very good. And before I begin, I'd like to thank y'all for this event. Thank you for letting me into your homes and offices. It's remarkable to think back at all that's changed in our country and in our world in just the last few months. Seemingly overnight, all of our familiar and comfortable routines were tossed aside in the response to COVID-19. I've been doing a lot of presentations to various groups since becoming AMA president in June. And as often as I can, I like to begin with a sincere thank you to the physicians, nurses, and other healthcare workers on the front lines of this pandemic. Their courage and their strength against incredible odds has been nothing short of heroic. And so whether it's here in Cleveland, in my home state of Texas, or in all corners of the country, I just want to take a moment to offer my gratitude on behalf of the AMA. All of us, I think, are seeking any ray of hope we can find amidst this pandemic, which is why our ears perk up every time we hear about or read news reports that suggest a COVID-19 vaccine is right around the corner. But the reality is that developing, testing, manufacturing, and distributing a vaccine is a complicated and expensive process. Given the urgency of the pandemic, though, normal vaccine development timelines are being compressed and public-private partnerships have been formed to provide funding. But the need for safety and efficacy must remain the top priorities. So in our conversation here today, we'll talk about the accelerated process for vaccine development in this pandemic. And I'll talk big picture about what COVID-19 is and what the AMA has been doing about it. I'll also talk about some of the AMA's work over the past year to help bring about greater equity across medicine, which of course has become only more urgent in the COVID-19 era. So that's a lot to get to, so let's get started. Quite simply, the novel coronavirus pandemic is one of the greatest public healths we've faced in the U.S. in a century. And it will take many more months, even years, to truly understand its full impact on our healthcare system, on our economy, and on our way of life. We've seen our lives upended in dramatic ways, from the healthcare workers who continue to work tirelessly to contain the spread, to Americans in every state who have made great sacrifices in service of the common good, heeding the advice of public health officials to minimize the risks of this deadly virus. We've learned a lot about how this virus works over the last 6 months. We know that transmission occurs primarily from person to person in close contact. Anyone can become infected. This virus does not discriminate. Seniors and those living with chronic health conditions are much more vulnerable to serious illness from this virus than others. And many more people are carriers for COVID-19 than have been tested because they may be asymptomatic or experiencing only very mild symptoms. They pose great silent risks to others. And we know better about what approaches are effective for treating patients with COVID-19 once they've arrived in the hospital, such as the use of corticosteroids to fight runaway inflammation and rolling patients on their stomachs so they can breathe better. These approaches are some of the reasons why the death rate has declined, even while the number of cases surge in many states across the country. But there's still a lot we don't understand, and scientists and researchers are rushing to learn more. For example, preliminary data has shown that COVID-19 impacts blood vessels and causes blood clots in some patients, leading to strokes and heart attacks. We're still trying to understand why. Now, unfortunately, this pandemic is an example of how health issues, even health crises, can sometimes be derailed by political agendas. COVID-19 is complex, and scientists don't yet know everything they need to know or want to know to aid in our response effort. But what we do know is rooted in science and evidence, and it's encouraging to see at least some political leaders on both sides now urging people to wear masks while in public and practice safe social distancing. In fact, just this week, the AMA launched a new national campaign online and through social media that encourages everyone everywhere to hashtag mask up to protect ourselves and those around us until a safe vaccine can be developed. What has become evident in this pandemic is that communities of color have been hit especially hard. Although we still don't have a thorough accounting nationwide, we've seen evidence of this everywhere that data has been collected. This includes reports from Cuyahoga County, where African Americans have far higher rates of hospital and ICU admissions than other racial groups. A Washington Post analysis found that majority Black communities have 3 times the infection rates and almost 6 times the death rates as majority white communities. Other national reporting has identified similar trends, which raise troubling questions about resources and the availability of care in predominantly African American communities. The data we do have suggests that the same chronic inequities that have long plagued our health system and society have led to devastating consequences for Black and Latino families. I'll talk more about these inequities and why they matter a little bit later, but the AMA has called upon the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as state and local health departments and institutions, to standardize, collect, and make publicly available all existing race and ethnicity data relating to COVID-19 so that we can better understand its true impact and effectively manage the response. The AMA, which represents virtually every physician, specialty, and state medical society, has responded to COVID-19 in 3 ways. First, we're providing trusted, evidence-based resources and clear guidance to physicians on the front lines of the COVID-19 response. Resources which can be accessed for free on AMA's website for anyone who needs them, ama-assn.org. Also, we're helping physicians and practices recover from the disruption and damage of the pandemic by pushing for loans and other forms of financial assistance for struggling practices and providing guidelines on how to safely reopen during this time. And thirdly, we are pushing at the highest levels of government to reduce obstacles to patient care, whether it's securing more personal protective equipment for frontline workers for the weeks and months, maybe even years ahead, or reiterating the need for widespread testing, both diagnostic and antibody testing, as states determine how to safely reopen once again. This work has ramifications not only for physicians, but patients as well. Consider the shortages of PPE, which has been magnified recently as more small private practices like mine begin to reopen. Private practices, I'm an allergist in Fort Worth, Texas. There are 3 physicians in my group. This is where the majority of Americans go for routine, sometimes even urgent care. Our health system cannot afford to keep private practices shut down. Research shows that people have been delaying routine checkups for chronic conditions throughout this pandemic, and that simply cannot go on. It will just create worse problems for people down the road. Politics should have no place in a public health crisis, but I think we all understand that sadly that's not the world we're living in today. Misinformation is spread so easily these days through social media and sometimes the media at large. So, as physicians, we have to stand up for science and make sure that it's at the center of our policy decisions. We must ensure that policy decisions are driven by facts and evidence and not ideology and politics. That's why the AMA continues to call on elected officials and major institutions to affirm science and evidence in their words and actions. So, let's talk about vaccines. The AMA has championed the widespread use of safe and effective vaccines since the early 1960s, when the Sabin oral vaccine was developed to combat polio. The vaccine development process is appropriately complex and multi-layered. I'm going to give you a quick primer of the key steps. The first phases are largely exploratory, and regulation and oversight increase as the candidate vaccine advances through the process. The first phase involves basic laboratory research and may last 2 to 4 years, something to keep in mind as we witness the speed at which COVID-19 vaccines enter the trial phases. So the preclinical studies use tissue culture or cell culture systems to assess the safety of the vaccine and its ability to provoke an immune response. So these studies give researchers an idea of the antibody and the cellular responses they might expect in humans, and this stage can last another couple of years. So once a new drug application has been approved by the FDA, the vaccine undergoes 3 phases of testing. Phase 1 testing involves a very small group of humans, often just looking at the dose. Phase 2 testing involves a larger group of people, typically in the hundreds, against a placebo group, looking more at side effects and efficacy. The phase 3 trials involve tens of thousands of people and are randomized double-blind studies, also against placebos. So phase 3 is where you first begin to understand how an experimental vaccine may work after its release into the real world. Again, this process often takes more than a year to complete. So once a vaccine has cleared its testing phase and receives FDA approval, it's then subject to additional monitoring requirements to determine its safety and effectiveness to ensure that it's really delivering on its claims. Operation Warp Speed is the government's method to compress this very long vaccine process to meet the urgent demands of our ever-shifting pandemic. It's an unfortunate name, in my opinion, because safety and efficacy are always number one priority when it comes to vaccine development. So whether it's accurate or not, this title does send a bit of a mixed message. Yes, we're all incredibly eager for a vaccine to fight COVID-19, but if it's not safe and it's not effective, then it's going to create more problems than it'll solve. Operation Warp Speed aims to do in several months what often takes years in the traditional vaccine process. But this is the important part. It does not sacrifice rigorous safety oversight. We got a head start because the basic tools for creating coronavirus vaccines were already there because of the work that had been done on SARS and MERS, both coronaviruses. So researchers are basically overlapping the steps taken in the study that are usually spaced apart by months. And a network of combined clinical trial sites for all of the vaccines in phase 3 trials is already open. The partners in Operation Warp Speed, including the CDC, the FDA, HHS, and others, have set an ambitious goal of 300 million doses of a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine by January 2021. Now, however this plays out, it's critical that physicians and patients have total confidence in the vaccine and the process that led to its development. This is something the AMA is going to continue to monitor very closely. And that means analyzing the peer-reviewed research and data and not just taking information sent out in press releases and through news articles. So where are we in this vaccine timeline? Well, as Dan said, we're aware of more than 160 experimental vaccines currently in the preclinical stage of development worldwide. At least 19 vaccines are in phase 1 trials. About a dozen have entered phase 2, and significantly 5 are now in phase 3 with some promising momentum. Interestingly, there's some parallel trials happening in China that have already led to one approval. CanSino Biologics, a Chinese company working in partnership with the Institute of Biology at the Chinese Academy of Military Medical Sciences. I doubt very seriously that this vaccine will make it to the United States. But the most promising of the experimental vaccines to date here are now in phase 3 trials, and there's 3 different categories of them. The first type of vaccine is different than any vaccine we've ever had in the US before. Instead of using weakened viruses or pieces of viral coding like we've used in the past, these vaccines actually use a piece of the virus's RNA, which is the template, if you will, for the manufacture of the spike protein that's on the outside of the virus. This spike protein that you've seen in various illustrations is one of the major things our immune system recognizes and attacks. So the vaccine being researched by Moderna and by Pfizer both use this approach. It's a really clever approach, but we have to remember that this is the first time we've ever made an RNA vaccine like this, and we have never made a coronavirus vaccine that was effective in the past. So the next vaccine candidate uses a Trojan horse model. It takes a different type of virus that has been activated, but it carries that spike protein with it so that our immune systems will attack it, but obviously it can't make you sick. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine uses this technology. And there are 2 Chinese companies, Sinopharm and Sinovac, which are using inactivated novel coronavirus itself to stimulate the immune response. Now, just as important are the ongoing conversations to ensure all who need the vaccine can get it. The National Academy of Medicine recently announced that it has formed a committee that will develop an overarching framework to help policymakers plan for equitable allocation of vaccines against COVID-19. The committee will consider what criteria should be used to set priorities for equitable distribution among groups of potential vaccine recipients, taking into account factors such as population health disparities. Now, this includes individuals at higher risk because of health status, because of occupation, living conditions, and geographic distribution of active virus spread. In addition, the committee will consider how communities of color can be assured access to COVID-19 vaccines in the U.S. and recommend strategies to ease concerns for those hesitant to receive a vaccine. So this is incredibly important work that bears watching. Now, we know that Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities have been hit especially hard in this pandemic. The many, many reasons why are far beyond the scope of this talk. It's been widely reported that African Americans, Latinos, are about 3 times likely as whites to become infected with COVID-19 and about twice as likely to die. So that makes it even more critical that we have diverse representation among participants in the testing and trial process for these experimental vaccines. It's vital that drug makers make inroads into communities they've historically ignored for clinical trials of disease. Communities where there is rightfully a lot of mistrust after decades and decades of mistreatment, exploitation, and justice. It was reported in Kaiser Health News recently that Moderna, the Massachusetts firm I mentioned earlier that has entered phase 3 trials, has worked to establish a relationship with the National Black Church Initiative to help allay fears and encourage participation among African Americans in their trials. Historically, African Americans make up only about 5% of clinical trial participants. Hispanics, far less. We need help encouraging people to participate in the trials that actually started enrolling volunteers about 10 days ago. So I encourage all of you to check out coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org. That's coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org to find out more about volunteering for trials. Now, there's a lot of talk about herd immunity and what it means for COVID-19. Herd immunity is achieved in two ways, either through a vaccine or through infection. Herd immunity can be reached when enough people have had a disease and recovered from it, developing antibodies to protect them from reinfection. It's thought that about 70% of the U.S. population, more than 200 million people, would have had to become infected with COVID-19 and survive for herd immunity to bring an end to the pandemic and protect those who don't have immunity. Now, there are two problems with this. The first is that such a caseload would instantly overwhelm our hospitals and ICU beds. That's why we wanted to flatten the curve at the beginning of the pandemic. And the second is that we don't know yet whether COVID-19 antibodies are effective in defending against reinfection. Sweden tried this herd immunity technique and failed miserably. So therefore, a vaccine really does remain our best hope to defeat the pandemic. And until then, it's critical that everyone understand his or her personal responsibility in helping slow the spread of the virus. Now, we've come a long way in this fight, and we have a long and painful road still ahead of us. Every day brings more suffering and hardship for thousands of Americans. So what can we do? Wear masks, practice social distancing, work together to flatten the curve as we did earlier this year. Encourage every one of your friends, families, and patients to do the same. We know this works. We can monitor the various vaccines through their testing phases and hope that one of them arrives soon, but only after it's proven to be safe and effective for everyone. We can encourage people from all backgrounds and from around the country to consider participating in a vaccine trial. And as fall approaches with many unknowns ahead of us, we should be getting our seasonal flu shots. This is important every year, but particularly this year. We will have plenty of flu vaccine to go around since manufacturers are ramping up their production to exceed what they've had in previous years. And at the same time, we should make sure that we're up to date on all of our routine immunizations, as many people have put off essential medical services during the pandemic. Now, all 50 states are in various stages of reopening, many states seeing a surge in infections. To fully reopen safely and prevent a second wave of infections, the AMA has said that 4 signposts must exist. There must be minimal risk of community transmission based on sustained evidence of a downward trend in new cases and fatalities, a robust, coordinated, and well-supplied testing network, a public health system for surveillance and contact tracing, and fully resourced hospitals and healthcare workforce. Sadly, many states are nowhere close to meeting these signposts. We cannot have a strong economy if the health and safety of our people don't come first. We must scale testing to the level needed to generate accurate and immediate data on the prevalence of the virus. Too many people are waiting weeks for results and in some cases not getting them at all. That is totally unacceptable. The AMA continues to urge the federal government to use its full range of resources, including the Defense Production Act, to address production and distribution challenges with testing, PPE, and other essential components. We must defeat COVID-19 in the same way we've defeated previous widespread threats to public health by relying on the scientific method and utilizing the tremendous resources now within our reach. So COVID-19 is the current backdrop against which we can see the results of centuries of inequities. Through our country's history, African Americans, Latinos, and others have experienced the consequences of structural inequities in healthcare. These inequities are well studied and documented, and they're a large part of why marginalized communities face disproportionately higher rates of chronic illness. There are many factors that contribute to a patient's health beyond the exam room, including poverty, level of education, lack of employment opportunities, job, housing insecurity, access to fresh food and public transportation, and discrimination, just to name a few. The AMA is committed to addressing health inequities in a systemic way, work that is guided by our Code of Medical Ethics, which instructs us to provide competent medical care with compassion and respect for human dignity and rights, and to respect the law, but also recognize our responsibility to seek changes when it's contrary to the best interest of patients. Last year, the AMA created a Center for Health Equity that works to promote equity in care, advocate for healthcare access research, increase health workforce diversity and cultural awareness and competency, influence the social determinants of health, and voice and model commitment to health equity. The Center's 2020 actions include so far raising awareness about the health impact of police brutality, urging comprehensive tracking of COVID-19 data by race and ethnicity, influencing AMA work to advance med school curriculum. At the AMA special meeting of the House of Delegates in June, which was a virtual meeting, our leadership pledged to take action on racism in healthcare and society. Specifically, we reiterated our position that we recognize that racism is an urgent threat to public health, the advancement of health equity, and a barrier to excellence in the delivery of medical care. We oppose all forms of racism and denounce police brutality and all forms of racially motivated violence. And we will actively work to dismantle racist and discriminatory policies and practice across all of healthcare. Now, I know that was a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time, but I hope it's a good starting point for our conversation this afternoon. I so appreciate the opportunity to be here at this urgent time in medicine. Thank you so much to the City Club for the kind invitation. And now I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Dr. Bailey, thank you so much. That was one of the most thorough presentations about the state of vaccine development around the world that I've heard. And I've been tracking all of them because I'm as concerned as anybody and out sort of looking for hope every day. So thank you very much for providing some of that context and some of that hope. If you're just joining us or you join us midway through, I'm Dan Malthrop with the City Club of Cleveland. Dr. Susan Bailey, president of the American Medical Association, is our Friday Forum speaker today at the City Club. It is, of course, another virtual City Club forum, so you're not hearing applause or people putting down their forks or anything like that. We're here on the air, and you're with us, or we're with you from the studios of WCPN IdeaStream. If you have a question for Dr. Bailey about any of what she discussed, racism as a public health crisis, vaccine development, all of it, send us a text, 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794 to text your question. If you're on Twitter, please go ahead and tweet your question at the City Club, and we will work it into the program. It's a question about this last issue you raised around discriminatory practices, racism as a public health crisis. And you said we will actively work to dismantle racist and discriminatory policies and practices across all of healthcare. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen those show up in the past and what the AMA is doing to end those discriminatory practices?
I could go on about that for quite some time. But the AMA has a significant role in medical education, whether it is undergraduate medical education of medical students, residents, and then the continuing education of physicians. it is one of our goals that our healthcare workforce look like our population. And our medical education population does not look like our current workforce. We have, there there are about as many Black men enter medical school now as did 20 years ago, even though there are many, many more positions available. And we are working with undergraduate colleges and schools of medicine to help improve the numbers of people of color in medical school. Financial aid programs are incredibly important. Mentoring is incredibly important. And so we're taking a very active role in that. We are working with hospital medical staffs around the country, helping to educate them about medical staff policies that might be perpetuating inequities in their systems. We can't tell an individual hospital what to do, or can't tell, an individual practice about who to hire and fire. But our point is that we need a healthcare workforce that looks more like our populations, and we're doing our best to make that happen.
Dr. Susan Bailey, another question for you. Can you talk a little about testing availability, about testing types and the accuracy? As you know, Governor Mike DeWine was tested twice yesterday and got two different results.
Well, that highlights one of the problems, is that accuracy is not always 100%. There are multiple types of tests out there. The ones that you may have seen illustrated using the nasal swab that, seems to go all the way to the back of your head. It doesn't, but it just seems that way. To sample secretions at the back of the nasal cavity. Sometimes a throat swab can achieve the same thing. Those actually look for live viral particles. And those are kind of the gold standard. We're working on saliva tests and other types of tests that might be able to measure the same thing. Some physicians are now getting worried that we've made some of those tests too good and that we might be over diagnosing coronavirus where none exists. So who's to say which of the governor's tests was correct yesterday?
He's getting a third test today or this weekend or something.
Even then, I'm not sure that the best 2 out of 3 is the way to go. But good luck to the governor and to those that are running his tests. The antibody test that many of us have heard about, I, as an immunologist, initially had great hope for these because we use antibody levels in the blood to specific infections in other diseases to determine whether or not that person is immune. And so I was very hopeful that the antibody tests would tell us just that. If the individual's immune system had been activated because they recognized the virus and had mounted an adequate response to it, making the person immune. We don't know if that's really how it works. We think that the immune response to COVID-19 is probably much more complex than just the antibodies. And we don't know what the magic antibody level is that makes you resistant to getting sick again. That's really the bottom line. Antibody tests certainly are not ready to be used on a widespread basis to tell people if it's okay to go back to work, if it's okay to go into a long-term care facility. At this stage of the game, antibody testing should only be used as part of a much larger evaluation of a patient's status. One way that it's very helpful in is determining someone who's had COVID-19, if they are candidates to donate plasma that can help others that are critically ill right now. Or to be used as part of a research effort to determine the level of disease in a community. So we need more testing. There's no question about that. We need to find that sweet spot of accuracy. But the bottom line is that we can't sacrifice speed for accuracy.
Related to testing is, of course, contact tracing. There were goals laid out that there'd be 100,000 contact tracers employed by this point, and I believe that the states are falling far short of those goals. What role is the AMA playing in advocating for contact tracing?
AMA has advocated for support of our basic public health principles, including testing, tracing, and isolation, which are the fundamental aspects of controlling any infectious disease epidemic. The contact tracing aspect of this has become problematic because we are now discovering that there are so many patients, children and adults, that don't have symptoms and but still may be capable of transmitting the virus. And that makes contact tracing less effective because you're just simply not able to reach everybody. We're able to reach folks that have been diagnosed with the disease, find out who that they've been in contact with. And so unfortunately, contact tracing has not been shown to be quite as valuable as we would have hoped. And of course, just the sheer numbers of people with infection has logistically made that incredibly challenging. It's still an incredibly important method of controlling an epidemic, but it's been one that's been very difficult to get our arms around at the same time.
Dr. Susan Bailey is president of the American Medical Association. She's the 175th president of the American Medical Association. She's our speaker today at the City Club Friday Forum. If you have a question for her, please text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. Or you can tweet it at the City Club and we'll work it into our program. Dr. Bailey, another question for you. Does the AMA have concerns about doctors who have been spreading misinformation, such as those who recently stated publicly that hydroxychloroquine is an effective COVID-19 treatment? What is the AMA doing about this, if anything?
The AMA has been completely clear from day one that all questions, all evidence must be rooted in science. We always go back to the science when we have questions. This is a very complicated virus. We are still learning so much about it, and our processes and things that we think have worked for the virus have changed over time. In the beginning, we were thinking therapies might help that we're not so sure help now, because we've looked at validated clinical trials that compare a medication or a procedure with a placebo. That's the best way to determine how something works. And so AMAs believe that doctors have an obligation to root their recommendations in science. Doctors also should have the freedom to discuss all sorts of options for treatment with their patients on a one-to-one basis and do what they think is best for that particular patient.
Another question for you. Some people claim that the high number of reported U.S. deaths is because people dying from other causes who are counted to and wind up inflating those numbers. Could you comment on that claim?
That's I have heard and been concerned about that myself. It is difficult to know exactly how many patients have died because of coronavirus infection. Then you have coronavirus infection that creates a complication that may lead to that individual's unfortunate death. COVID-19 can contribute to someone's death from other causes. And so it's not necessarily a binary, totally black and white question. Did COVID-19 cause this death or didn't it? We will have a lot of follow-up and a lot of work to do to get adequate numbers. Transparent data is incredibly important. And if we don't have that data, we can't make good decisions in the future. I think we also need to think about patients out there that may have died because they didn't get treatment for their coronavirus and may have gone undiagnosed. So that might change the numbers in and of themselves. But in terms of huge inflation of numbers distorting the reality, no, I don't think that's a problem. Coronavirus has killed tens of thousands of people. And if we don't social distance, wear our masks, and wash our hands, it will kill tens and thousands more.
Here's another question for you. It's a bit long, so bear with me. Do you think we are missing an opportunity by not starting now to organize a massive national readiness campaign that actively involves people of all ages and from all walks of life in collecting glass to recycle for the injections, for setting up church and school locations to which people can come and get vaccinated, identifying potential factories that could be retooled to manufacture so that we could roll out vaccinations as soon as the formula becomes available? The benefit would be that it would build positive momentum to get more people enthusiastic about getting vaccinated the way, say, the greatest generation did when it came to collecting pennies and so forth. Can you imagine the sense of togetherness we could build after this time of such division?
Wow, that's what a hopeful thought that is, and I love the sense of community and really even patriotism in that that we would all work together. Right now, we don't know how the vaccine's going to be distributed, so it's kind of tough to decide how we can help get those places up since we're not sure where they're going to be yet. That decision will be made later on this fall. Only certain types of glass can be used to manufacture the bottles that vaccines are contained in, but I know that manufacturers are already at work on that, making sure that they have plenty of glass bottles available. So right now, I think the best thing that we can do to work together and protect each other as a united country is to wear our masks, wash our hands, and keep our distance.
Related to that, I understand that some of these vaccines that are in phase 3 trials, that they have already begun mass manufacturing in the hope that they will turn out to be effective. Can you speak to that?
Yes, that's one of the aspects of Operation Warp Speed. Typically, a vaccine company would wait until they were extra sure that this vaccine was safe, reliable. The phase 3 trials had been done before sinking money into mass production of a vaccine. Operation Warp Speed is providing the financial resources so that the vaccine manufacturer can go ahead and take place overlapping the phase 3 trials. So many of the phases that I mentioned before have been overlapped because there's been some relief of paperwork and some regulatory burden. But much of it has been financial incentives for the companies to take steps and start doing things that normally they wouldn't do until they were really sure that it was a good investment.
In your speech, you mentioned that some phase 3 trials began as early as 10 days ago. How long does a phase 3 trial take?
Well, back in the day, phase 3 trials used to take a year or two. We're hoping to get these phase 3 trials done in a matter of months. The ultimate endpoint that we're looking at is how many patients in the placebo group get coronavirus, how many patients in the vaccine group get coronavirus. And we're not going to deliberately expose people to coronavirus. That would be unethical. So it will take time to see how many people just in their regular course of life and work get the virus. But I do know one reason healthcare workers are being recruited especially heavily to get the vaccine because we know that they're going to be exposed much more often.
And a phase 3 trial is typically around 30,000 participants. Is that right?
Well, that's how many we're enrolling right now. They try to get as many as they can and try to find the sweet spot because obviously phase 3 trials are very expensive to conduct.
So a matter of months, could be the end of the year, could be, but not likely sooner. And I'm asking this because the president has specifically said recently in interviews that he thought maybe early November.
Okay, the enrollment in the phase 3 trials began, well, let's say 1st of August. So August, September, October, that gives you 3 months to gather the data. We don't know how long it's going to take to enroll 30,000 people in the trials. I think enrollment is proceeding incredibly rapidly because the Coronavirus Prevention Network was funded to help facilitate this. So, even if we had 30,000 people enrolled today, which we don't, 90 days takes us to the 1st of November. That's incredibly optimistic. And it will be a challenge to make that happen.
And even if, say, you and I had enrolled and had been inoculated last week, you'd only have 90 days worth of data. You wouldn't know necessarily about long-term efficacy.
No, we would not. So that's one of the reasons that phase 3 trials have to last long enough to get you the data that you need and enough statistics that you can properly analyze.
And I think it's worth noting again that website is coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org if you want to enroll, and people are strongly encouraged to enroll, particularly members of non-white communities, because as you said, less than 5% of clinical trial participants are African American, and the number for Latinx is even lower. And that seems really important. Could you talk a little bit about why that's so important? Because and how if we don't get diversity right in our clinical trials, we may not get the vaccine right?
It's so incredibly important that the trial participants are of a wide variety of ages, a wide racial mix, an equal male-female mix. It's challenging because you don't want someone who's already very ill to be in a vaccine trial. And then if they get sicker, you're not sure if it was because of the vaccine or if it would have happened anyway. And so, but it's incredibly important since people of color that live in, that may be in disadvantaged communities, are particularly hard hit by COVID-19. And it's especially important that there is trust of the vaccine, trust of the medical establishment so that they'll, get the vaccine and feel confident about it and feel comfortable giving it to family members and recommending it to their friends. This needs to be, it's an all hands on deck effort. We need to have everybody involved. And communities of color in the past have been very suspicious. I learned something this weekend from during a seminar I gave at a meeting of the National Medical Association, that back when polio virus trials were being conducted back in the 50s, Blacks were not included in those trials because it was falsely assumed that Blacks didn't get polio. So they didn't seek to have them in their vaccine trials. And so as a result, millions and millions of Blacks were needlessly infected by polio because they hadn't been involved in the vaccine process. We can never, ever, ever let anything like that happen again.
Dr. Susan Bailey of the American Medical Association is our City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum speaker today. If you have questions, text them to 330-541-5794. or tweet them at the City Club, and we'll work them in. Dr. Bailey, the fall flu season is nearing. Are there any precautions that we should know about getting a flu shot now and a COVID vaccine, assuming one becomes available?
Yes. First of all, I encourage everyone. The AMA thinks everyone over the age of 6 months should get a seasonal flu vaccine every year, but especially this year, because our healthcare systems are typically overwhelmed during cold and flu season, and having COVID-19 at the same time is just a recipe for further disaster, as if our health systems haven't been stressed enough. It's important to remember these flu and COVID-19 are completely separate viruses. Getting the flu vaccine will not keep you from getting COVID-19, and getting the COVID-19 vaccine will not keep you from getting the flu. But the good news is that we foresee no problems getting both vaccines, and we'll probably encourage individuals to do that. The timing we're not sure about, but basically it's going to be very important, I think, to do both. The people are going to need to be extra, maybe do a little bit extra work to get their flu vaccine this year, because our healthcare delivery system doesn't look like it did last year during flu vaccine season. You may be working from home. and your workplace may not offer the flu vaccine like it has in the past. You may have to make an appointment at your doctor to get the flu vaccine rather than doing it as a drop-in like you might have done in the past. So be prepared, do your homework, make sure you know where you can get your flu vaccine. But there should be plenty. We're not anticipating any shortages. And hopefully, with the social distancing and mask wearing and hand washing, we'll be able to keep a lot more people well this winter.
It seems to me that one of the worst possible outcomes would be to forego a flu vaccine only to get the flu and then get coronavirus on top of it.
Well, and think about it. If you get a fever, body aches, congestion, cough, your healthcare provider is probably going to assume it's COVID-19 until proven otherwise. Flu can be successfully treated with medications if it's diagnosed very, very early on in the course of the flu. Some of the medications that are available really need to be given probably within 48 hours of the onset of your symptoms. And if you're waiting for a COVID-19 test to come back and not get the flu treatment that you might need, that's a terrible scenario. So just having these two demons exist at the same time is going to be quite challenging. And boy, if we could eliminate one of them, that would be great.
Another question for you, Dr. Bailey. I appreciate the attempt to rebuild trust with the Black community. How is that being communicated with physicians across the country?
Education, education, education. The AMA is engaging through its Center on Health Equity, but also working with state and medical specialty societies across the country to deliberately educate themselves on cultural competencies and understanding the inequities that exist in the system, things that they might be inadvertently doing in their practice to perpetuate some of those inequities, and reaching out to their patients to make sure that they get all of the information and vaccines, medications, whatever that they need. It's really all about communication. It really kind of all boils down to that. And we must be willing to answer our patients' questions. We must be willing to demonstrate an attitude that we're willing to take questions. And it's all hands on deck, as I mentioned before, but I think education is an incredibly important part of the equation.
And Dr. Bailey, with if and when a vaccine or multiple vaccines are available, is it safe to assume that there will be a prioritization of how those vaccines are distributed? And will that move in ways to address inequities, some of the inequities that you've discussed?
Oh, definitely. The National Academies of Medicine, as well as the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, are studying this issue as we speak to determine what the priority ranking is going to be. Like you said, we're not going to have 33 million doses of a vaccine and give it all to everybody in the country at the same time. So there's got to be a priority distribution, and I anticipate that communities of color will be high up on that list, as I anticipate healthcare workers and patients over the age of 65 will be. But we don't have those recommendations yet. We're waiting for those recommendations to come out. I don't know when that will be, but hopefully it will be soon.
And finally, Dr. Bailey, are you hopeful, and what gives you hope?
Oh, I am hopeful. We will beat this. American ingenuity and scientific expertise is unparalleled. And we have come so far and done so much in such a short period of time that I am confident that we are going to beat this. I don't know what new normal is going to look like. I don't know how long we're going to need to wear masks or social distance. There may be some things that we've done in life that we don't do the same way again, but we will be okay. We will adapt. We will work together. And I am confident that we will beat COVID-19.
Dr. Susan Bailey is the 175th president of the American Medical Association. She's been our guest today, our speaker today for the City Club Friday Forum. Dr. Bailey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Dan. I enjoyed it.
And thank you. You too. Stay safe. And thank you for your leadership. As you know, we're going to continue to present our forums throughout this time, either on virtual platforms or here from the IdeaStream studios. And we're able to do this thanks to the members, sponsors, and donors, and others who support our mission to create conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. You can find out more and join them at cityclub.org/thank you. Next Friday, August 14th, we will commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment with a forum on the documentary film Represent, which follows 3 women running for office for the first time. Hope you'll join us for that. And if you have other ideas about topics or speakers we should feature while we continue to quarantine and get through this all together, as Dr. Bailey said, please get in touch. You can find out how to reach us at cityclub.org. We welcome your emails, your suggestions, your tweets, your Facebook comments as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Please stay strong. Please stay healthy. Please wash your hands, keep your distance, wear a mask, and stay close in your hearts if you can't be close in person. I'm Dan Malthrop. Our forum is now adjourned.